Thanks very much, everyone. I am actually going to be... I love this place. This is a great bar. It's got a great pint of Guinness, and you can tell from my accent that I'm Irish, and that's a very important thing to me. But also, I often come here for gigs and things, and on Sunday I'll be playing a gig with my son, because his music class has a gig here. We're due to do a guitar duet, and we did some practice yesterday, and he said, "Do you think you could play the woodblock?" So I'll be doing a woodblock duet, and he was like, "Do you think maybe you could keep your bit to the very end?" So I'll just be tapping the woodblock at the end, and we'll see how we go with that duet. But I'm hoping tonight will be better for my self-esteem, as I have been studying this topic for many years, and hopefully I can convince some of you, or at least partially convince some of you, of the value in getting rid of prisons. So I'm what you might call a prison abolitionist. That's somebody who's committed to the idea that prisons don't work, and therefore we don't need them, and we should live in a society that doesn't have them, or at least aspires not to have them. And if we're to believe the last election, where the leading party, or two of the leading party, or the parties that formed government, ran on a platform that we needed to increase the number of people in prison. That was one of their key performance metrics for their government. We want to increase the number of people in prison. They looked at, spreading the economy out so there were fewer poor people. Didn't like that. They looked at increasing literacy levels. Didn't like that. They looked at increasing health. They didn't like that. So what they decided to do was to increase the number of people in prison, and that's the thing that they're going to be really most proud of at the end of their government. And I want you to think about the possibility that that's not the way to go about running the country, and that there are other ways in which, certainly within the criminal justice sphere, we can think about how we value our community and our prisons. Because something really interesting happened in the last 6 or 7 years in New Zealand, which hasn't happened globally, isn't part of a global trend, and it's that the prison population from 2017 to, well, whenever the last election was, 2023, dropped by about 30%. And I want you to think about that, because that's unusual, because that was booked a huge trend of relentless increase in prison population in New Zealand and across the world. And I think that's a really, really interesting phenomenon. Now, don't worry, national voters, it's back. It's back. It's as high as it's ever been, and it's going to go higher and higher. So it's wonderful for those guys. But for prisoners and for society and for all of us, I wonder if that's really the case. So I want you to think about how many people we need to be having in prison. And so, as a prison abolitionist, my aspiration would be to have it at 0. And I know that that's quite a big ask. So don't worry, I'm not rushing off to Christchurch Men's with the keys, opening all the doors, letting everyone out. I'm talking about how we build a society that doesn't need prisons, or at least only needs them for a very tiny number of people. And look, abolitionism isn't something that has a pope or some sort of high priest of abolitionism. So I think when abolitionist scholars get together, they sit around and they fight about all sorts of things, as scholars do. I recently heard that universities are a diverse range of people who can dispute all facts and come together only by their hatred of the university's parking policies. So all abolitionist scholars are like that as well. So I'm not asking you to agree with me on every one of these facts, but I want you to think about whether we need all of the 10,700 and something prisoners that we have at the moment, and whether we need to drive that up to 14,000 or so in the next 10 years, which is the projection for the current sentencing regime that we have in this country. So let's work our way through this. I've put up a series of questions, and I'm pretty sure one of them is how many prisoners, which I've just told you, so no prizes for that one. But does anyone know how many adult prisons there are in New Zealand? Anyone want to take a guess? 6? Up? What was that? 8? Up? Down? Down? 18. Yeah, exactly. So 18. One of them is privately run, so it's run by a company called Serco. Serco is, I'm told by my friends in investment, one of those really boring companies that everyone has in their pension. And I think that's really interesting because, slight aside from where we're going, but ultimately, when you send someone to jail, you're doing it to inflict pain upon them. And hold that thought, because that's really the core of it. And it's a bit affronting when you hear about it in those terms. We have this whole building in town full of people, very well-paid judges, who sit there and they inflict pain on other people. And they do it for justified reasons. There's great justice in this. They are sending them to pain, they're inflicting pain upon them to do that. And that's a system. Whether it's a right or wrong system is something for discussion, but that's what they do. They inflict pain upon them. And they get the prison service, or the Department of Corrections as it's called in New Zealand, and they inflict pain on them. And they get a private company to inflict pain on them. So everybody who has a Serco share in their pension is profiting from selling their services of people they've hired to inflict pain on other people. I hope that troubles you as much as it troubles me, but I suspect if you dig into your pensions, those of you who are lucky to have pensions, and if you're like me, people who are going to get pensions anytime soon, you will probably find that you may have that, not just Serco, but other companies that are involved in inflicting pain upon people. And I think there's a real philosophical question about that and what that means in terms of private provision of prisons. But let's move on to my next question. How many youth justice residences are there? Does anyone know? You want to guess? Children under the age of 18 who are detained. We don't call them prisons because they're children. 12. Down. 10. 5. So it is a lot fewer than there are adults in prison. But ultimately, we don't call them prisons. We call them youth justice residences because even though we're containing them within buildings, we don't want to sort of call it prisons because we work with different language when we're inflicting pain upon children. We then call them youths. They're youths when they're in the youth court. We have children's courts for family and family courts for family matters, but we have youth courts for criminal matters because youths are bad. And so we have youth, and so we have youth justice residences. You can tell me the difference between that and a prison, I'd be interested. But, and indeed, there are abolitionists in America who refuse to call them prisons. They call them cages. And I think that's an important thing because it's what's happening. We're inflicting pain upon people, and we're putting them in cages. And we're doing that to young people. And in principle, a young person as young as 10 can be sent to a youth justice residence. Now, they're very unusual. There are no children convicted of anything under the age of 12 at the moment, but it's still possible. I've already told you there are 10,700 and something prisoners, so we'll skip that one. Does anyone know what percentage of those are Maori? It's 52% are Maori. So at the last sentence, 20% of the population claimed to have some sort of whakapapa, and so to be in some way Maori, but yet 50% of the prison population are Maori. That is pretty shocking. In the female prison estate, it's even worse. It's 62 or 64% of the female prison population are Maori. And I think that's a really interesting point to think about when we think about prisons, because we often frame our discussion about crime and crime control around public safety and all of these sort of things. But when you study criminology, as I did, one of the sort of iconoclastic things that happens when you're early on in your studies is someone says to you, well, it's not really about crime control, it's about controlling problem populations. And you look back over history, and who is the majority of the population of various prisons down through the years, all through the history of the prison in England, all through the history of the prison in New Zealand? It's problem populations. It's black people in America. It's Maori in New Zealand. 2% of the population of Australia are Aboriginal. And something like, I really wish I'd checked this out while I was waiting around earlier, but it's 7 or 9% of the population of the prison population of New Zealand, of Australia, are Aboriginals. That's 4 times their representation in the normal population, which when you consider their which is just absolutely shocking. So it's even worse there than it is here. But it is awful to think that that's really what's going on with the criminal justice system. And we create these structures, and I am a barrister, I've defended people in court many times. We create these legal structures with structures of rights and so forth, but it covers over the fact that the entire process is to control those who are too poor to be controlled through civil law matters, or are too poor to be supported and are too poor to be able to make ends meet and so forth. And we don't look after them on the basis of their well-being and their welfare. We look after them through incarcerating them. And I think that's a huge problem. What are my last 2 questions? Oh yeah, what? Oh, I don't know the answer to the second last one, so we won't do that one. Should have, oh no, I've written it here. This is great, okay. Well done me. what percentage are serving sentences shorter than 2 years? Anyone want to guess that? 74%. So a huge number of people serving shorter than 2-year sentences. Hold that thought. I'll be back to that in a few minutes. And my last question was, what is the longest sentence a child can receive? Does anyone want to guess? Life. A child can get a life sentence. We have a few children serving life sentences in New Zealand, and that's, I would suggest, out of step with international standards. Obviously the British, very cruel country, they send a lot of children to jail for life. They have something, when Britain left the European Union, the day before they left, there was 444 children serving life sentences across the entire of the European Union. The next day, the British left, and the European Union had 4 children serving life sentences. So Britain is particularly and peculiarly cruel in its justice system. And that's a thought to think about when we move on to the next slide. Because if you look there, we are above England in how many people we send to jail for the size of our population. So I've just told you how cruel England is. We send more people to jail per head of population than they do. So this chart is a set of selected countries. I haven't listed all 194 countries in the world. It wouldn't fit and it would be really tedious. We look at countries on how many people they send to jail for their size. So per head of population, for every 100,000 people, how many people have you gotten in jail? So I always thought it was America was the worst offender for this, but actually El Salvador sends 1 in 100 people in El Salvador in jail. That's pretty wild. But Louisiana in the United States is also in a similar level. So the USA is a peculiarly punitive country, and I don't think we should be comparing ourselves to that. Russia is not a democracy, so we can skip over that one. But then of the countries that we do compare ourselves to, Australia, England, Ireland, Canada, we're way ahead of them. And this is, I think, a troubling statistic. Because actually New Zealand is, in many ways, very progressive. We were the first country to have universal suffrage, almost 100 years before the Americans did. And, you know, we have a long-standing kind of, I don't know, living here, I think a lot of us have this sort of acceptance that we can complain and complain, but we have a reasonable standard of human rights and rule of law and so forth within New Zealand. But we are incredibly punitive. We like to send people to jail, and it's bizarre, because sending people to jail is really expensive. And if you look at those countries, you look down through that list, I think you'd struggle to tell me there was any relationship between safety in those countries and the number of people in prison. I don't think anybody in Christchurch seriously thinks that we are less safe because we send fewer people to jail than someone in America who's walking down the streets of Detroit on a Tuesday night. And equally, if you look at Papua New Guinea there, 54, same number of people per capita sent to prison as Norway. I don't know which country you'd probably feel safer in, but it's probably almost certainly nothing to do with the number of people that they're sending to jail. So we send a lot of people to jail, and I'd say that that's pretty unnecessary, and I think it's something we should be concerned about. I would be more concerned about our place in that ranking than in, say, the Rugby World Cup rankings or the World Rugby ranking. But yeah, there you go. It's just one of those rankings, and it's not a ranking that we think about. We think about our GDP per capita. How do we get that up? But we don't think about how many people we're sending to prison for the size of our population. So let's talk about how we might live without prisons. So a few years ago, there was a report leaked. It was called the Hei Pua Pua report, and it was about Indigenous, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And a group of experts had come together to look at what did New Zealand need to do to meet the standards expected of countries with Indigenous populations. And it was really unpopular, especially with those on the right. It was like, they were like, oh my gosh, how can we be expected to share the sovereignty of the country with Maori? It's absolutely outrageous. And they totally lost it, absolutely got really upset. Terrible, terrible that the UN was coming to tell us how to run our country. It was awful. And nobody ever came out and said, I disagree with the fact that on page 34 they said we should get rid of prisons because they are so detrimental to the lives and well-being of Indigenous populations. Nobody mentioned it. Now I suggest this is because certain members of the political class don't actually read the reports that they give out about, and that's absolutely fine. But I think there's also a really interesting point there, that there is this sort of realization internationally and among people who work in the field that we do need a decarceration strategy. We do need to reduce the harms of prisons and the damage that they do. So I'm going to ask you to look at a couple of things now. I'm going to talk about what is prison for and break it down to why we have it and see if any of that resonates with you. And then I'll talk about the possibilities of attritional prison abolition. The next two slides are... Oh, the next three slides are time black holes, so I'm going to have to try and keep moving or I'll blow out your evening and it could get really, really boring. So, yes, I think Nicole has a flag. I'm already on the yellow. Oh, my God, right, we're going to flash through this. Right, I can skip the following two ones, I think. Well, let's see how we go. Right, so 4 reasons that we give for why you have prisons: deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation, incapacitation, and I once gave a tutorial where someone said vacation. It wasn't a graded tutorial because they would have got 0 for that, but these are the 4 reasons that we give it. And the first is deterrence, this idea that we're stopping people from committing crime by sending them to jail. Now, did anybody today not punch anyone in the face because of the sentencing structure for assault? No? Did anyone not do a ram raid because of the increased sentencing for ram raids that was brought in by the National Party? No, I suspect it's not. I suspect most of us didn't do any ram raids today or yesterday. Let's broaden it out just in case Wednesdays are a bad day for ram raiding. We're all so busy with football and ballet and whatever it is. There are social and structural reasons why we don't resolve our disputes like that and we don't make our living like that. And there's almost no evidence that deterrence works in terms of the criminal justice system. Retribution is the one that works. We inflict pain on someone for something they did. We say it's a just measure of pain, and we're really good at that. And prison is painful, prison is miserable, and it does exist. Rehabilitation, less so. 40% of prisoners will be back in 2 years in New Zealand. That's shocking. If the Ministry of Health was losing 40% of the population every 2 years, we would probably stop calling it the Ministry of Health. If the Department of Defence only defended 60% of the country, I don't think it credibly call itself that. But we call it the Department of Corrections, and it only works for a very small proportion of those involved. Incapacitation, sure, people aren't on the street while they are in prison, but they are also committing crimes in prison. They are also engaging in violence. They are also running witness intimidation and drug rings and so forth from prison. So it's not a perfect answer, incapacitation in prisons. I only have a couple of more minutes. Those are some areas where we can suggest you could get rid of the prison population. Something like 30% of the prison population are on remand. So should they really be waiting for trials that we don't have enough courtrooms to have for 18 months? Is that justified? Do 18 months waiting for your trial, and then when you get out because you didn't do it, or the witnesses doesn't show up, or whatever it is, the case collapses, you've lost 18 months of your life because we can't run our criminal justice system. And do we compensate you for that? No, we don't. Should children be in jail at all? I would suggest no. There's a strong evidence that women shouldn't be in jail at all, except for the most serious offending. And most women go through very short sentences and revolving doors relating to addiction and relating to low-end offending and so forth. Mental health issues. 10% of the country has admitted to having mental health problems. 91% of people in prison have similar problems. It's something like 80% of people in prison in New Zealand have a traumatic brain injury. That's huge, and those people are being dealt with by a prison. That sounds to me like a health issue, something we would deal with in the health system and not in the criminal justice system. And I'd say the same thing for drug addiction. Should we really be dealing with drug addiction as a justice issue rather than a health issue? Only about 2% of people are able to give up heroin in a year, in any 1 year across the world. Some tiny percent, it may even be less than that. And yet that's what we expect from the criminal justice system and the way we manage addiction to serious drugs at the moment. We expect individuals to walk away and desist from those drugs with almost no support. And we expect that if they don't do that, we will punish them severely and send them to jail. Now, as a chocoholic, I can tell you that giving up chocolate would be incredibly difficult for me. It wouldn't be affected by being sent to jail, and I would continue to sneak chocolate and to hide chocolate, and I have a sort of a bizarre sort of issue about where the chocolate is hidden in the house, sort of trying to hide it from the children, know where it is, and not let my wife know that I'm eating as much as I am. So like, and you know, it is a problem. It's not a very big problem. But if you've got an actual addiction, it must be much worse to be expected to do that. And I can't imagine how anyone would do it because a judge told them, or because there's a risk of it. And certainly my clients who had drug addictions, they would do anything to fulfill those drug addictions, and it didn't matter what sentences we gave them. So I'll skip the next slide because it's really boring. And I'll finally say, and I think Nicole wants me to wrap up, that one of the great abolitionist thinkers is a woman called Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who was asked, what do we do? And her answer was, we take the money and start again. So the budget for the corrections department in New Zealand is $2.89 billion in 2025. That is insane. Now, a lot of that's to build new prisons, so presumably once we've built them, we'll all come back down. But that's an insane amount of money, you know? I was talking about how insane this was to a friend of mine, and he said, well, that's half the amount of money they spent on football transfers in England in the last transfer window, which I think is a statement about wealth inequality that we'll save for another nerd night, and a statement about how small New Zealand is. But $2.89 billion is a huge amount of money. If you can think about what that would mean, we spend something like $120,000, $140,000 a year on every prisoner. That is incredible. Like, what kind of job would you have to be? That's like 10,000 people on 140 grand a year. It's incredible amount of money. So why wouldn't we start spending this on supporting people and encouraging human flourishing rather than on inflicting pain on people? Prisons have failed us, they don't work, and I would urge us to think about ways to move on from them. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, James. And you
Questions,
can stay up there and we'll have questions. We have 2 microphones if anyone wants.
Thank you for putting a spotlight on this subject tonight. I wondered what your view was on traditional Māori systems as in Mauru restorative justice.
Yeah, personally, I think they're great when they're used. They're fantastically successful. They are used a lot in youth justice. I've certainly seen them. My practice area was in London for about 10 years before I came here. I've seen derivatives of them used there with great success, and they're used often in drug courts and with great success. They don't work for every kind of crime. They don't work for some sort of forms of serious offending, and they almost always require that the offender admits the offence. So they're problematic if there's a dispute between the state and the individual about it. But yeah, they're fantastic, and not only the process of them, the process of the offender meeting the person that was their victim, and the discussion and the healing that can come out of that, but also the outcomes are often really, really successful, and they're brutally, cynically speaking in the language that certainly this government pretends to prioritise. They're much cheaper as an outcome than the penalties that are involved in them are much cheaper to impose and manage. So yeah, they're great, and we should be leaning into that. We have this incredible knowledge in Te Kanga in this country that we can draw upon, and I think the more of that we do, the better our criminal justice system will be. Thank you.
Thanks, that was really interesting. So if you could wave a magic wand and make one change in New Zealand, what do you think is the most important? Where's the biggest bang for our buck? Because it seems like we could sort of tinker around the edges of the legal system, but it almost seems like there's a sort of societal attitude that needs to change. So what do you think would be our most effective change if we could just change it?
It depends how much of a change am I. I'd get rid of the prisons, right? But
that's not a solution.
Yeah, no,
right?
Of course,
you need to replace it with something.
Yeah. I think the number one thing the simplest way to do it is to do something about the remand backlog. I mean, that seems incredibly straightforward or an incredibly obvious problem that needs to be fixed. And that seems to be, so when Labour got the prison population down by almost 30% in its 6 years in power, there's no kind of prison reduction law passed. There's no sort of statutory instrument produced by a minister sent to the Department of Corrections saying this. And that when the National Party got into power, they sent a memo to the head of corrections and said, tell us what they did to reduce the prison population. We have to repeal all of it and get these people back into jail. And they were like, well, they didn't do anything. And it was actually about a kind of a vibe. And I've spoken to so many people in corrections, and everyone's like, oh, I don't really know. The best explanation I can find is they spent a lot more time and effort on looking for accommodation for people who are on remand, because we have this huge backlog in our court system. We build a lot of prisons, we don't build a lot of courtrooms. And if you have a jury trial, which you need for serious offending, you need quite complicated buildings that have jury boxes, have separate rooms for juries so they don't meet judges and lawyers. It's quite an architectural exercise. So we spend all the money on the end of the product, but we don't spend any money on the process, on the bit where human rights comes into it, where justice comes into it. And so while we've got all these people with this big weight, corrections started to make a real effort to find bail accommodation that people could stay in. And so that was the main driver, it seems to me. And I'd be really interested if anyone works in corrections and has a different view to that. But from what I've spoken to people in corrections about, that's the thing that's driven it down so much. So that seems to be the easiest win, to get it down 70%. But I would, and another one would be getting rid of child life sentences. I don't think we should be sending children to jail for life. If all of the civil law countries in Germany, if all the countries of South America can survive without sending children to jail for life, I think we can as well. Yeah, so those would be my top two straight away.
Thank you so much, James. That might be all the time we have for now, but definitely talk to James in the break if you'd like to.
Thank you.